Welcome to the Coptimizer Podcast, a platform dedicated to uncuffing your true potential in public safety. We're here to provide you with valuable tips and insights that will help you optimize your life and career. I'm retired Chief Patrick Flannelly, and I'm honored to be your guide and coach on this journey. Here, I'll share the latest insights and strategies to help you survive and thrive in the demanding world of public safety. Our noble duty is to protect and serve. We embody the role of peacemakers in our communities. However, this profession's immense physical and mental demands come with a price. If we fail to take a proactive approach for our well-being and lead ourselves first, then the stress from the job can and will lead to poor health outcomes. We have all seen it play out. Not only does this impact our professional and personal lives, but it also affects our ability to fulfill this sacred duty. Like many of you, my journey has been filled with tremendous challenges, with highs and lows. However, through creativity, experience, and a positive attitude, I successfully managed over 30 years in law enforcement, emerging healthy and happy. Now, I am driven to share what I've learned to show you that the path is not all doom and gloom. There is hope and a profound purpose in serving your community, and I'm here to show you that it does not have to come at the cost of your health and well-being. Join us as we explore cutting-edge research, interview top experts, and share inspiring stories of transformation. Whether on duty or off, it's time to optimize your potential and live your best life. Get ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered. This is the Coptimizer Podcast. Greetings all. Welcome back to another episode of the Coptimizer Podcast. As usual, I'm excited about my guest. And I guess if I ever get to the point where I'm not excited about my guest, it's probably time to hang this stuff up. But David Berez, he is a retired police officer from East Windsor, New Jersey. And he's got over 20 years of law enforcement experience, and combine that with EMS and a few other really interesting stories. I think you're gonna be really excited to listen to this episode. David's the author of A Resilient Life: A Cop's Journey in Pursuit of Purpose. I'll put that up here so for people can see it. I just got done reading this book. I read it. I had a couple long flights. Not super long, but over the week, I was down in Florida for the DECA World Championships, Old Man Fitness. And I'm going to do an episode on that coming up. So stay tuned. That's going to be the kickoff for 2025. And in season 3, we're going to talk about a different form of resiliency, but it's all interconnected. But after all that, I'll shut up. David, thank you. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be one of your guests.
Well, I don't know. Honor might be a bit of a bit of a stretch. I just love having these conversations, and I'm just going to say it right now before we get going. You're the first person that's made me cry. I'm not going to cry on the podcast, but I am good to admit that.
Hey, vulnerability is all right, my friend.
I had some tears, man. I had some tears. I'm on an airplane. I'm like, man, I hope nobody sees me. As I was reading your book, and that's just going to be a little teaser. I'll tell you, you can probably predict at what point that happened to me. But I think your story is so important for people to hear. We talk about Coptimizer, cop optimization, physical, mental, emotional resiliency and well-being. And I've been at this game for a long time. I've been teaching wellness classes since the late 90s. I've come at it from a lot of different angles. But your story is the why. It's why do we do this? And why is it important to keep doing this work? And, with that being said, I want you to tell the story of your book. I've got a lot of notes written down and some things that I think will be fun to talk about, but also important, and not just for, frontline officers and supervisors, but for law enforcement leadership, so they can understand sometimes the impact that they're having on their people, and being aware of it. I think we'll have some interesting conversations when we get to that part of the book. But enough about me and enough about my intro here. So how about a little bit about you? So give us a little bit of your background and how this all unfolded.
So, as you mentioned, I'm a retired police officer from East Windsor, New Jersey. And the way I like to describe our location for any of our history buff friends, that we are in an area called Washington Crossing. So if you remember U.S. history from 10th grade, where Washington crossed the Delaware before the Battle of Trenton, we are living in the battlefield itself. So when you see signs around here where George Washington slept here, he actually did, as opposed to some random place on your family vacations over the summer.
That's cool.
So I live here in Hopewell. I worked in East Windsor, same county in the Trenton area. I did 20 years with the East Windsor Police Department. Prior to that, I did 10 years as a volunteer with the East Windsor Rescue Squad, starting at the age of 14 years old.
Which is crazy, man. That's absolutely, I was like, all right, I got to ask him about this.
It was a wild experience. For me, it was an opportunity to get out of the house. I had a little bit of a tumultuous family situation going on. And so it was just a great way for me to get out of the house. And I always wanted to be a doctor. So this kind of was the start that I thought was right for me. But that's actually what led into the police career. And then after I retired from law enforcement, I did a couple years with the Office of Emergency Management in the town that I live in. But my retirement itself was not great. I didn't do it with grace. I didn't do it with purpose. And that kind of led me down, a tough spot for the first couple years. But the first 6 months were definitely the hardest. And when you do the math on that, when I retired in 2020, we're walking into COVID. Then we walked into all of the civil unrest following the George Floyd stuff. And I was sitting at home on the couch and listening to my friends get their butts handed to them, during these riots and locally. And I just didn't know what to do with myself. It was weird. So I thought, maybe I could support either the command center or support the guys in some way, shape, or form. It didn't really work out. Ended up just dropping beers off people's front porches in the middle of the night. So when they eventually did get home after their, 10 days on and 5 minutes off, that they had something to unwind with. But in hindsight, today, 5 years later, I probably wouldn't do that anymore. I'm realizing the downfalls of alcohol in combination with stressful moments. So
Yeah.
that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, so I was realizing that I was not in a great spot. And then July 29th of 2020, my good friend Danny, who is a detective sergeant here in Trenton, had taken his own life as a result of just everything that was going on, the betrayal of his community, the betrayal of his command staff, the betrayal of his squad, the betrayal of family. And it threw me for a loop. And then I realized I was in trouble too. And what I had started doing actually just prior to Danny's death was I was trying to figure out my own path forward. And I didn't really see one, to be quite honest with you. And I started keeping sticky notes and tabs of how I wanted my kids to remember me after I died, and not the person that they were seeing in those 6 months post-retirement. And those sticky notes turned into a notebook worth of notes. And someone looked after that and said, "Eesh, I think Dave's got a problem. Let's let's see what we can support him with." And then, when Danny passed away, I had written an article that I was just posting on LinkedIn, and it hit like 70,000 people, 75,000 people, and then some national media as well. And one of the friends that I've had over the years worked in the same county, but a different town, was now the chief resiliency officer for the county for a new program that we were starting statewide. Each county had a resiliency officer that reported to a statewide resiliency officer. And he was like, yeah, I think Dave's got a problem. So he called me and was like, hey, you all right? I'm like, and what do we say, right? Of course I'm
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
good. Uh, so he's like, nah, I don't know about that. This article is kind of concerning for a bunch of us. So you can either take this new class that we're given to be a resiliency officer, or I can maybe send you on a 30-day vacation to Florida. And I was like, I'll take the class. So we did that, and my book ended up, sorry, my sticky notes ended up turning into the book. So essentially, my sticky notes were coming up on a suicide note. And that's what they noticed as well. And so it was a good opportunity for me to recalibrate, as our good friend Jocko would tell us. And my sticky notes and my suicide note turned into a book. So that book actually saved my life as I went through it and wrote it. And it was such a cathartic process. And it then set me on this journey through positive psychology. And my graduate thesis in positive psychology ended up being about the humanities and the art of storytelling, and how that is not only cathartic for the expressive individual, the person writing or telling the story, but the person receiving that story, a receptive piece as well. So that's kind of where we're at today, and trying to raise awareness for all that that cops go through, and giving that, not just raising awareness and telling stories, but also giving them tools as they can prepare for the next phase of their life. And for the young kids that are starting to get into this job, give them the tools so that maybe they don't have to manage the stress in the same way that we did. And the stress is going to be there. It's how you deal with it and how you move forward with it that changes the way we do things. So that's kind of where I'm at now. That's a long-winded introduction to say, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
No, it's perfect. It's a great setup. A lot of things I want to touch on there. I'll go back though. I will tell you that I was born in Westchester and lived there that's right outside of Philadelphia. And I played Little League in Great Valley. So Great Valley Little League, which is their home to Valley Forge, which is another Revolutionary War historical site. Pretty cool. So I
Great
appreciate
spot. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I appreciate the Washington story. I love to read. Everyone knows. Like I often ask about books on this podcast. But have you ever read 1776, McCullough's work?
I haven't.
You have to read it. You'll really, really enjoy it, because you'll feel like you're living in the pages, because you'll be familiar with all of the areas and what was going on. It's just a fantastic story.
Right now.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you a funny story, but while I'm on this, it's completely off topic, but I was just having this conversation again over the weekend, but it has to do with New Jersey, and maybe you're familiar with John Hart.
The revolutionary John Hart?
The revolutionary John Hart.
Up the street for me.
Oh, the revolutionary one. The 13th signer of the Declaration of Independence. All right. So I'm going to go back to the early days of Facebook. And this is like 2009 timeframe, somewhere around in there. And my high school, someone who was coordinating our reunion, one of our reunions, put this invite out on Facebook. So I had to sign up for Facebook. And I was working narcotics at the time. So I was out working one night till like 3 or 4 in the morning. I'm tired. I come home, I go to bed, and like I'm in bed for like an hour, and I wake up and there's a message on my phone, but it says it's from Patrick Flannelly. And I'm like, well, that's weird. Like, I'm half asleep, so I put the phone back down. I go to bed. I'm going to make this story. It's a long story. I'm going to make it quick though. And when I wake up the next day, I look, and it's from Patrick Flannelly from Dublin, Ireland. And wow. He just says, hey, just, sending notes, a little shout out to my namesakes around the world, introducing myself. So we became friends on Facebook, and that led to another person reaching out to me who was his last name was Flannery. I won't give his full name, but he is a researcher from Dublin who's doing research on the Flannery clan from Ireland. That's where all my roots were. So I thought, with the name of Patrick Flannelly. And so he asked me, he's like, hey, we're doing this project where we work with a company called Project DNA. They're based out of Houston. If you want to submit a sample of your DNA, we'll find out if you're related to the Flannery clan here, blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, yeah, sure, why not? So I do it. And of course, all my cop buddies are like, what are you doing? Like giving your DNA to some stranger you met over Facebook? And I'm like, nah, man, I actually did research on the company. They're legit. It's not like so I do this. And I wind up getting a big, like a 20-page report back. It's really cool. It gives me kind of like the family history, everything. It turns out I'm not related to that clan, but I do get a lot of background information. So fast forward a few years, out in Pennsylvania, I dropped my one of my sons was at Penn State for a wrestling camp, and I'm driving around with my youngest son, and I take him to Valley Forge, and I take him to some of the other places. I still have a sister that lives there, and so I got to see all of the sites and everything. And my youngest son, got to see it as well. Well, a couple days after I get back, I get this email from a researcher, and he says, hey, because when I did sign up for this project, I did say, if you're directly related to me, you can contact me, or if any researchers are doing research, they can contact me as well. So I get an email from this researcher, and he says, hey, we're doing a study on John Hart, the 13th signer of the Declaration of Independence. We've been scouring all of the available DNA, looking for descendants of John Hart, and we found 2 direct Y descendants of John Hart, and you're one of them. And I was like, what? Like, how is that? Like, and my dad at the time was, he was kind of in early stages of dementia, in his mid 80s, late 80s. So I asked him about it. He had no idea. Like, that didn't make any sense to him. Our whole family story is like we're like both of my mom's and my dad's side, like directly related from, descendants from Flannellys and Boyds in Ireland. My parents grew up in Scranton in that area. So it's like, so anyway, it's a long story of saying, when I went back to work, I just started walking around the halls, and when I saw people that day, I was like, you're welcome. And they're like, for what? I'm like, for freedom. And they're like, oh my. So I got to tell that story. Now,
So I'll add to that real quick and say that obviously John Hart was a lifelong resident of Hopewell here where I live, and one of his nephew descendants has a place called John Hart Farm locally here in town where my daughter rides horses. So
awesome.
we are also connected to the original John Hart through this John Hart and his farm.
All right, you're going to have to tell him that you met one of his relatives that he didn't even know he had.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a big sidetrack, but I'll just throw it out there into the podcasting universe. So if anyone's doing research on John Hart, then
a guy.
I know a guy. So let's go back. You're 14. You join the emergency services. Now, I have 3 boys, and 2 of them are lifeguards, and they both started when they're 15 as lifeguards. But how do you start as an EMT when you're 14? Like, I didn't even know that was possible.
So in the state of New Jersey, to be certified as an EMT by law, you have to be 16, but you can join the rescue squad as a junior cadet at the age of 14, and you cannot ride on the ambulance till you're 16, but you can work around the building. You can be with other first responders when they respond to calls. There's ways to kind of like push the envelope. You're not really supposed to be on calls, but we had such a small community and such a small organization that sometimes the extra hands help lighten the work. And I did find myself in times and places where probably legally I shouldn't have been, but
Yeah.
you do your thing. So, yeah, I joined there when I was 14 with my best friend at the time. And I won't mention his name because he's gone on to do other things that are not great. So, we'll just say my friend at the time. And
I know who you're talking about. You mentioned him
yeah,
in your
it's in the
book.
book. It's in the book. So we did that, and it was a great experience. And I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about people. I learned a lot about things that go on in town that you would otherwise never know happened, and about people that you wouldn't think it would happen to. So
Right
it was
on.
an
That's a
interesting
peek behind the
experience at a
curtain.
very young age.
That is definitely a peek behind the curtain for that age.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the Nicolas Cage movie, Bringing Out the Dead?
Mm-mm.
All right, put that on your list. You will thank me later. It's a story about paramedics from New York City. I think it's one of Nicolas Cage. I'm a big Nicolas Cage fan, but I think it's first responders will really appreciate it. It's a pretty crazy movie, but you're exposed to a lot of trauma, and
100%. And at that age, you're
that's a
not
lot
ready
at that
for it.
age. No, yeah, but oof. Well, I don't know. Are you ready for it, or is modern life? Have we just kind of sheltered young men and women from the natural order of things, right? I
So
mean,
and that's a fair question. And I think looking at it from a psychological perspective, maybe not ready for it isn't the appropriate terminology, but maybe not prepared.
yeah,
So I think that you can be ready for anything at any time as long as you're properly prepared and know how to deal with the things that come up along the way. Like I didn't have anybody to talk to about the things that I saw or did. They just kind of like stuck in there in a box. And we didn't have true debriefings for the most part for every little thing. And at 14, 15, 16, any kid age, you really should be talking about these things as nominal as they may seem at the time. Even if it's just a standard CPR call that didn't have all the blood and guts, you should probably be talking about that stuff and being able to process it out loud. I don't think we did that. Not that I remember anyway. And there, for the big calls and major catastrophe stuff, yeah, we had debriefings, but even at that, they were minor.
well, we didn't do any debriefings early in my career. I don't remember doing any.
Yeah, on the cop
Like,
side, we didn't do them at
yeah,
all. Yeah,
yeah. People talk about just you mentioned CPR, right? It's the first time you feel someone's ribs crack underneath your hands. I'm
gross.
sure every
Yeah,
every doctor out there or any nurse that's worked in an ER, knows that feeling way too well. They don't, they tell you that stuff in CPR training, like, hey, don't worry about it, just kind of keep going. They don't tell you about people puking in your mouth. That's why you wear.
yeah, it's a
I,
treat.
yeah, beautiful, beautiful stuff, right? But yeah, that is a lot for someone that's your age. But you think about it, and the reason you did that, and you talk about this in your book, just a bit of an escape, getting out of the house, looking for some kind of purpose, something to do.
Yeah,
So, what was going on at home? What was, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
yeah. My parents had a crappy marriage, and my dad was verbally abusive, and I don't think, and I don't know for a fact whether he was physically abusive to my mom or not. She never expressed that he was, and I never saw any indication of that. But the verbal and the mental and emotional abuse was, can be just as harmful in different ways. And yeah, it was tough to be around. I did not have a good relationship with him either, and he was really hard on me is not the right word because that could be a positive thing too. But he was, emotionally abusive to me. I was just never good enough, and I could never do anything to satisfy the guy. And in the end, he turned out to be a turd anyway. So happy to know that I wasn't living up to his expectations because the ones he had for himself were no good.
Yeah, and when you're first responders of all sorts, whether it's police, EMS, fire, you get exposed. You learn very quickly in this profession that the apple does not fall far from the tree at times, and you can see generational abuse. You can see the path that people get on. So, I just say that because I've always had a lot of admiration for, young boys and girls that come from that type of environment that are able to overcome it. And oftentimes it's because, they find something within themselves where they can see the path out, and they have the resiliency to do it, or the fortitude to do it. And then sometimes it's somebody else reaching down, reaching out, giving a hand, like, a neighborhood dad, a neighborhood mom, someone that pulls you in, makes you part. And you kind of had that story too, right? And that was your introduction to policing, through the father of a friend.
Yeah, absolutely. When we look back at our childhood experiences, there's a scale where you can kind of adjust for what you've been through, and the ACEs scale, the adverse childhood experiences, and that speaks to stressful and traumatic events that happened during your childhood or adolescence. And I think those of us that experience a high level of ACEs or have a high ACEs score are more likely to go into professions where we're trying to help others. It's a coping mechanism, and it helps you heal when you support other people in their healing journey as well.
So do you wear any type of wearable tech? Like I wear a Whoop strap here.
Yeah, I have my Apple Watch.
Okay. So, Apple Watch, I don't know if they are.
It's not as good as the isolated things like a Whoop strap, but
Yeah, well, I mean, Apple Watches are good. My wife wears an Apple Watch, but she also wears an Aura ring.
yeah,
So the Aura ring, the Whoop, they're good at tracking heart rate variability. So
yep.
there's been some great research on this. And I listened to a researcher from Ohio State. He was a strength and conditioning coach. This was years ago, that like early in the days when I really started tracking HRV as one of the metrics that I was, just trying to look at for overall wellness improvements. And for those, just a real quick cursory description of what heart rate variability is. So you have your systolic and your diastolic blood pressure. You have these peaks and valleys, and anyone that's seen an EKG knows the peak and the valley. Your HRV is basically your time between those peaks, and what you want is high variability. You don't want consistent like 0.3, 0.3, 0.3. You want 0.7, 0.1, 0.9, and without going into all the science on it, what that is, it's really a measure of the stressors on your emotional systems and your emotional regulation, your body's ability to regulate stress. And this research from Ohio State was talking about, speaking about wrestling. He got to the point where he said he could predict how good a wrestler was going to be when they came into the room based on two things: grip strength and heart rate variability. The higher the HRV, the higher the grip strength. If I remember this correctly, don't quote me on it, but he was basically saying in Ohio State, one of the best wrestling programs in the country. So everyone that's coming in there is an All-American. So he would use this as kind of a predictor for, who's going to be an All-American, who's going to be an NCAA champion, who's going to be an Olympic champion, world champion. And one of the interesting things that really stuck out in this interview where I was listening to him, he said some of the best wrestlers that were coming in had very low. They were some of the most highly conditioned athletes in the world, and they're coming in with very low heart rate variability, which is an anomaly, really. And what they found is that those that low HRV tended to have very high score on things like the ACEs, like they were carrying a lot of emotional trauma.
Interesting.
So it just goes to show you that unresolved emotional trauma is it is having an impact on your physiology, and at some point it's going to express itself in different ways. So yeah, something to put on, for those that are out there, if you're tracking now, HRV is highly individual. I had a couple of people on the podcast where we've talked about it. Yeah, Elise Balbon and Catherine Plua, couple others. We've talked about this in past episodes, but I just wanted to get that little, since you mentioned ACEs and childhood trauma, it would be interesting to, I guess, maybe if someone were going to do some research on police officers testing what their HRV looked like early in their career and then tracking it over time just to kind of see what kind of impact that has on other aspects of their performance on the job. And then, maybe even, life post law enforcement.
So there's actually a great company in Canada, drawing a blank on the name. I'm trying to pull it up as we have this conversation. When I was doing my some of my research for my graduate program, one of the ideas that I had come up with, or I thought I had come up with before 85 million people before me had come up with it, was doing some sort of biological biometrics while you're working and have that somehow connected to a CAD system that you're using for work. Therefore, if your stress meter gets pegged for something that you're doing and it triggers an alert to either your boss or a peer support person to check in with you after the call was over. But what I found out doing some of the background research for that discussion was there's a company in Canada that has these wearable t-shirts that have these small little electrodes in them that measure all of these biometrics. But you wouldn't know it's a regular t-shirt and you wear it during work. And while it's not connected to a specific CAD system, you can go back and review the data within the platform that they have. And they weren't that expensive. I think they were like $80 or $100 a shirt, but the software was super expensive. It was like 10 grand for the program. But I thought that's an interesting concept to
It's
go back and
Hexoskin,
look on
by
the
the way.
stress markers of your people. And honestly, if there's something that you keep going back to that triggers you to that place where you need that support, stop sending that person on that call.
Yeah.
Like let's give the world the best version of ourselves and use our strengths rather than continue to put ourselves in these bad spots. Because the author and doctor Vander Kolk writes that book, The Body Keeps the Score, right?
Yes.
And when you go back to the research that he has in that book and the way he lays it out, your body holds on to that stuff literally forever. So if you're not managing it, you are just building up this pressure cooker and something's eventually going to give.
Yeah, so that's awesome that you mentioned that. By the way, so the company is Hexoskin, and
There you go.
Plua.
That's the one.
Well, Catherine Plua, that's one of the reasons why she and I connected, and I had her on the podcast. So you'll have to go back and listen to that episode, and we talk about
that's
that.
crazy connection.
Yeah,
I wrote a paper about them actually.
Oh, well, you'll have to send that to me because I'd love to read it. But, I was working on a project very similar to that before I retired. Maybe at some point I'll pick it up, but I do think that's, when you think about performance, we're going to kind of skip ahead here, right? Because there's, you mentioned something in your book when you're at that 18 and a half year mark or so in your career, and you mentioned a few things where, hey, you should have recognized that maybe this was a cry for help. What I've always been fascinated in or interested in is like we have like these EWSs in software and technology, things for use of force. And listen, if someone has 20 uses of force in a month, where in the month before they only had one or two, and that's an anomaly, then the theory being, well, maybe there's something going on, and this person is now prone to a stress reaction. They're overreacting under pressure or under stress. I've always been a little bit leery about stuff like that, but I do think there's value there because it could just be, hey, maybe he's changed districts or beats or the part of the city or the job that he's doing that now every night he's fighting with people. And believe it or not, people, that does happen. Cops are out there arresting people that are doing bad shit. So it's not just a matter of, every time we use force that it's unjustified and for different reasons. It's always really the other way around.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, we got off track here.
Yeah, it tends to happen to me a lot. I get off track, but the idea, the reason I bring that up is because this concept of having a dashboard or a health dashboard or some type of
Yeah.
metric that's a visual display for not only for you, like what I love about a Whoop strap is I wake up and if I'm in the red, it doesn't necessarily mean like that's a bad thing. It just means that my body's in a low recovery state because I was in red on Sunday, but that's after 2 days of competing in the Deca World Championships. Like I'm physically taxing myself at the end of a 2 week cold on top of that. So that didn't help me at all. I needed a couple of days to recover. And I always thought for cops, coming to work, having a dashboard that just kind of said, "Hey, I'm in a low recovery state," and a supervisor even to have that information, that might be beneficial because now we can say, "Hey, look, you still got to go out and do the job, but now you're going out there with a level of awareness, like, you know what, maybe today's not the day that." I go hard charge, and maybe today's I'm more of a maintenance mode. Or it could be from a supervisory perspective, depending on how long somebody's been, in a low recovery state. It might be like, hey, you're going to work a desk today, or, we've got the manpower, so I'm going to have you go to the training center or do something that's not going to expose you to the likelihood or the possibility that you might get involved in a foot chase, in a fight, in a car chase, or something that could lead to, uh, a controversial type of, the use of force is, they're always controversial whether you're having a good day or a bad day. So, if we could, try to minimize some of our personal and agency exposure through technology, hey, why not? So
I agree.
I'd be fascinated to, yeah, I'd love to read your paper if you want to share it.
Yeah, it wasn't an extensive one, but it talked about the technology pieces that are potentials for monitoring the stress. Listen, like you said, the stress is going to happen, but how
Yeah.
do we manage it? How do we utilize the data that we have to not put ourselves in those predicaments?
Well, we don't call this podcast the Coptimizer for nothing. So it's
That's
all
it.
about cop optimization, right? And I a lot of I love your story and the impact that it can have. And I've talked about this previously. I came to emotional and mental resiliency and well-being late to the game. I came to officer wellness from exercise, nutrition, physical readiness, physical well-being. And it wasn't until really probably like 2005 to 2008 timeframe that I really kind of started to realize, like, look, all of these things are interconnected. You can't separate them, and you can't have one without the other. And at some point, if you're operating that way, something's going to break.
You can't have one without the other, but you can't be an expert in all of them either.
Right.
And I think it's important to understand what your strengths are and how you can best support the overall mission with your particular strength characteristics.
So you're let's get back on track here. Sorry about that. That's my fault. So your buddy's dad introduces you to law enforcement. You eventually you're thinking about going to med school, um, but maybe academically that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I
Your story
graduated high
is not
school
you.
barely, the little 1.8 GPA. I got out of there because they didn't want me to stay any longer. I enjoyed algebra so much, I took it twice in high school. So it's it wasn't my strongest moments, but now I ended up getting into college at Hofstra University. I had a great time there, which that may be part of the problem as well. But my first year, when I thought I wanted to be a doctor still, and I took botany as the first science class, which is the science of plant cells.
Right.
I did
You
not.
start growing your own weed.
Yeah, it was pretty. I didn't do that, but it was pretty close, pretty close. And I never made it to labs. I didn't get it. None of it made sense to me. Just it wasn't. It turned out not to be for me. So I went home that end of that first semester with some not great grades. where the school really said you probably shouldn't be coming back here, but they did accept me back, and I went changed tracks and went into social science and criminal justice, law enforcement stuff. So it really it made a big difference, and I found my place, found my people, found my niche. So it worked out well.
So your first job as a police officer was in another one of my favorite places, a lot of childhood memories at the Jersey Shore.
It was
Yeah, like I spent every summer, like up until age 10 in Stone Harbor. So, but
much better than Seaside.
going to the boardwalk and other places like that, that was always fun. So now you're a young seaside. So what was that, a full-time gig, part-time?
So in New Jersey, we have something called Special One and Special Two officers. Special One is you get a week's worth of training from the agency. You get handcuff training. You get PR 24, which is a side handle baton training. You get how to write a ticket effectively and not get them kicked back by the boss training. And essentially, it's a command presence piece for the agency. You're in full uniform, but you don't have a gun. You don't have all of the extra equipment and stuff. But you're walking the boardwalk. You're walking the parking lots. You're writing parking tickets. You're a show of force essentially. And we did have the ability to make arrests as special ones. And if you want hands on with somebody, you better put handcuffs on them. And so I did that the first summer in Seaside. And then if you successfully complete that and you don't get your butt handed to you, or you don't not show up to work, they will send you to the police academy over the winter. And I did that, graduated from the Ocean County Police Academy, class 72. And then I went back as a special two the following summer, which is a fully certified police officer, but working part-time. So the hours that you're there, you do have all full powers of a full police officer. Just when you leave for the day, you're not a cop. You leave your gun there, you leave your badge there, you're off. So it was a great way to break into the field. And in New Jersey, that's how a lot of us start here. A lot of us start as boardwalk specials. And you definitely learn how to talk to people. You learn how to fight because you get all the, as we call them here, bennies from New York and down at the Jersey Shore, making a mess with, what we now know is fist pumping and whatever else they're doing. That stuff's been going on a long time, long before the TV show ever made a mess of it.
That's funny.
But we have fun. It was a good way to break into the business. I loved it.
Yeah, today it's interesting because there's a lot of discussions about whether you should do programs like that because, whether you've got a week's worth of training or a year's worth or 10 years worth, you lay hands on, the liability is the same, the risk are the same. Right. So do we want to put people out there and expose them to that risk when they might not be, trained to the capacity that they should be? But on the flip side to that, we also have this recruitment and retention crisis in policing. Some don't call it a crisis. I do. And it's something that, came long before George Floyd and probably even before Ferguson, that we started to see this decline in the number of people interested in our career of policing, the profession. So, exposing people to the job, in a way like that where you can kind of dose them. I don't know. I don't know if I have the answer to it. I definitely have mixed emotions and mixed feelings about it.
I can see both sides of the argument.
Yeah. But if you're young, I mean, hell, you're excited about doing that. I was like, you probably would have done it for free.
100%. I virtually was. I think we were getting paid $8 or $8.05 an hour back then. So it was,
that's enough to buy beer, right? And if you have a place to, lay your head at night, who cares?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would stay with my buddy who lived down in town for many of the nights. We had a good time.
So, so after that, you have the training now. You're late in your college career, and then you took another job that I thought was pretty interesting, working for the coroner's office. Do they call it the coroner's office? Is
So
that
in New York City Medical Examiner's Office,
okay?
or because in New York everything's reverse. It's like FDNY instead of NYFD. So it was OCME, it was Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. Uh, and that was an interesting experience. That was an internship after college, between college and Seaside. And I learned more in my 1 year there as an internship than I did my entire police career, I think. It was a great and interesting combination of what interested me in the medical field as well as in the investigative field of police work. So combining those two, at that point, joys in my life professionally, it was a really cool way to mesh them. But man, did I see a lot and learn a lot. If you can die from it, I saw it that year. It was crazy, absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and I know you talk about like seeing like your first um well, I guess it would have been the would your the pathologist cutting the body open and doing an autopsy. And yeah, I still remember and I was much older than you. I think I was 27 when I started. I was a military police, but we didn't do any of that stuff. I was walking around airplanes for the most part. But yeah, that I'll never forget my first autopsy. That's for sure. And sadly, it was a young 14-year-old kid died from a gunshot wound. Um, but
Yeah,
yeah,
it was.
you don't forget stuff like that. Watching
Nah, it's the smells too. Honestly, the smells,
burning skull.
the
Ugh.
sights was not as bad for me as the smells. So like when we would pull out people from the bottom of elevator shafts that were burned up, or even the floaters that came out of the river, uh, and then you get down to the pathology room, or where we did the autopsies, and man, the stink that was in that place was unbelievable. So you just can never forget it. It lives with you forever.
Yeah, and you can't wash it off either. That's like it just
Nah,
sticks. It just stays with you.
yeah.
Anyway, I digress. Let's not. Let's
That's not part of the optimism piece here.
I know, but I will have to say, like, my buddy that was with me, who was competing with me over the weekend, when I was reading some of your stories in the back, um, there's one in particular. I'm not gonna. We'll just say that someone's still alive, stuffed in the cupboard. Like that one brought back some memories for me from another case. I'll tell you offline. I don't want to tell that
Yeah,
story.
the
Yeah.
Airstream incident. Yeah, that was
I made him read it. I handed the book over, and I'm like, "You got to read this." And so sometimes I like doing that to my non-cop friends, and just like, "Hey,
it's funny because
here's
people
one for
don't
you."
realize the crap that we see. And some of it in the end, like now is humorous. Like that one was, horrible in the moment, but now I look back on that and that didn't hasn't negatively impacted my life other than it's a hell of a story to tell. Uh, but man, some of the crap that we've seen over the course of our career, you can't make it up. Hollywood doesn't have the creativity to put real life into film.
No, and it's getting closer, right? So, and especially with VR and things like that, and the minute they can, with things like Neuralink, once they can tap into your olfactory nerves, so when you watch, call it smell-o-vision,
Yep.
they've done that they've done that in old, like in different ways, like in theaters, right, where they have like the vibrating seats and
Yeah.
the misting things that spray out. Like there is a way to do it, but that's not going to be one that I'm going to go watch. I'll promise you that. I digress. So you do that, you're gaining all this experience. So whether you understand it or not, I mean, you're probably having fun. You're probably just really enjoying this, but the things that you're learning and you're getting exposed to very early on are going to be incredibly valuable for you, in your career as you're moving forward. Just the background, like even we joke about it, right? But even being a botany, having a semester or two of botany training, and then later in your career you became a DRE, so you learn things like, well, yeah, I picked this up early in life. I didn't think it was going to be applicable, but look at this, it's coming back now. So I just say that as a way for for people that are listening to this that might be considering a career in policing. everything is a learning experience, and there's a reason why you're doing something. So don't discount experiences, even if it's a job that you don't like or you don't work very long. There's always something that you're going to take away from it. Um, and I would say
That's a
that even,
great point. And
yeah,
I love that you said that because I didn't realize I was a lifelong learner until about 18 months ago. And I wish I knew that when I was 6, that I would be a lifelong learner because I think you look at things differently and you absorb them differently, you process them differently. And it's not just, algebra where you gotta, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally method. And like, I just, if I knew then what I know now, as far as how important it is, not necessarily what you're learning, but how you're learning and where you're going to be able to use these, we just don't teach that well enough at a younger age to make people interested in being lifelong learners.
yeah. Well, we could go on another
Yeah, that's a whole
another
nother show, my
tangent
friend.
about that, right? Yeah,
Whole nother
it is
show.
important. Wrote, letting people pursue things that are interesting to them.
Yeah.
Rote memorization, does have its purposes, but yeah, let's not even go there because it'll be like 2 hours long. But so, so you move from now you're like, earlier, well, let's just kind of go back to the day because I thought it was pretty cool, like the day you got sworn in, and I made some notes in the book about that experience. Talk about the day you got sworn in as a police officer for East Brunswick.
East Windsor.
In Windsor, sorry. I don't know why I
Yeah.
keep saying East Brunswick.
It's
Brunswick.
only 20 minutes north of us, but that's all right.
Uh,
The so yeah, that was a really special day. And it was honestly the most accomplished I'd ever felt in my entire life. It was better than college graduation. It was better than anything else I had ever done up to that point. I was there. My mom was holding the Bible, uh, which will prove to be special as the rest of my life moves forward. And my grandmother was there. My sister was there. And it was the proudest moment for the sense of personal accomplishment. But on the flip side of that, it was also the proudest FU moment I've ever had for people that always told me I'd be nothing, couldn't do anything, nothing, I wouldn't be anything more than a garbage collector. And I don't say that to disparage garbage collectors, but that was the phrase that was always told to me. And I, I knew at that moment that I had survived the worst of my childhood and the worst of uh, even my pre-childhood, before I was born, what my family had been through to even come to this country in the first place. And it was just the greatest FU moment of my life, combined with the greatest sense and feeling of accomplishment. And the only thing I missed was my grandfather not being there because he would have been so proud to have seen me standing there in uniform, knowing what he went through to get to this country and what he lost, which caused him to get to this country. And man, I look back on that moment and I still smile just thinking about it today because it really honestly was one of my proudest moments in my life.
yeah, and something I mentioned in my notes, we didn't bring it up, so it got a little out of sequence. I chuckled when you were describing, filling out that 30-page application for the police department. Um, and,
In pencil,
it's,
by the way, in pen on paper. There was no computers.
yeah. And, it's interesting because, you know, early in my tenure as chief, I took over as chief at our agency back in 2012. And we had already kind of seen the dip in number of applications that were coming in. So, it accelerated during Ferguson and it accelerated again, post George Floyd, like the decrease. But we got into these discussions about whether we should simplify the application process. And a lot of agencies moved to these one-page screening pages. And our agency, we resisted that. We tinkered with something similar just for a bit, but our concern was like if somebody's not willing to fill out that long app, that takes someone wants this job when
Yeah,
they fill out that application.
I agree.
And when they're done, if there's things that are missing, if they've omitted forms that they're supposed to submit, that tells you a little bit of something about an applicant. But someone that will do that, And then maybe they don't make it through the first time, but then they'll do it again and go through that whole process. So now you're on to somebody that really wants to do this job. Now, at that point you got to kind of you got to make some determinations, but it's I don't know. I just bring that up because I think agencies that shorten that process just to get more applicants in the pipeline, you might catch a few that you otherwise would have missed, a few good ones. But I think for the most part, all you're going to do is make yourself busy
Yeah.
weeding through applicants that just aren't there for the right reasons.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think there's something to be said for the tenacity and the grit that goes into the application process. And yeah, if if your heart's not in it, you're not filling that thing out. So it's an easy way to push people aside and move on.
So you hit the street. You're working nights. I chuckle at that too because I spent most of my, I think, what, 12, 13, 14 years either on nights or on afternoons, but it was almost all midnight shift. And I loved nights, but trying to sleep when everyone else is awake is kind of, that can be a challenge in and of itself.
For sure.
So maybe talk just a little bit about like some of your early experiences when you're working the street.
Yeah, my favorite time in that early part of my career was actually during field training when I was working with a partner. Because our agency, we didn't have a partner per se on your day to day. We had a squad of people that would work together, but you were alone in your car days or nights. And so FTO was the only time that I really rode with somebody other than, a special assignment or an abnormal type situation. So that was great to have somebody with you all the time. There's such a benefit into that. And if I could recreate things for myself or for an agency, even in a small agency, I would rather see two-man cars on the road in a night shift than four one-man cars on the road in a night shift. I would make that change tomorrow if I had the power to do so. But so I had some interesting experiences. We were always chasing around lots of people, but always the same people. So it was the same, dozen people all the time. We're frequent flyers. And it was great. I got to learn things about the town that I grew up in that I didn't know existed, places that I didn't know existed. And I'd been there my whole life. It was kind of strange. And then I was meeting people in two ways. One, I maybe never knew them before, so I was able to expand my network, both positively and negatively. You have great interactions as well.
Yep.
But what was very interesting to me was I didn't realize some of the people that I thought I knew, I didn't know anything about. And whether it was family situations or just people that I thought were good making bad choices. And so, yeah, we ended up staying busy. We had at that point, there was a pretty big transition in the culture of our community. Growing up, I think our high school was 98 or 99% Caucasian. And I think there was one large Hispanic family that had 13 family members that made up the entire Hispanic community in our high school. And we had maybe three or four people that, Black community that was, I don't know, maybe 10 kids total in our high school. It wasn't much. And then the community started to evolve and change. And then as my career went forward, the Hispanic community became a large part of our of our town. And at this point, I think they're at like, I don't know, 12 or 13% primary English speaking in the high school, which is crazy. So it's really come
Wow, it's
complete
flipped.
swing.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
completely flipped.
So those challenges, different communities bring different challenges. And it was interesting. But yeah, I learned a lot and met people that I didn't ordinarily have other contact with. It was a great experience, and I wouldn't change it for anything.
So, what year was that when you were on the street?
I started East Windsor December of '99,
Okay.
and then most of my career was in patrol. I did a couple stints through Detective Bureau. I did a lot of community policing work. I was a DRE for about two-thirds of my career, which was probably my favorite special assignment to have. I loved that.
So you're asleep one day after a midnight shift, just getting to bed, and your phone rings. It's your sister. Talk about that for.
Yeah. So it was September 10th, 2001. I went to work for night shift, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was a beautiful night. Stars were out, moon was shining, and it was a pretty quiet night. We weren't too terribly busy. We did run into a couple things, nothing major. And I went home at 6 o'clock in the morning, lying in bed. And usually when I got home after night shift, I'd have a beer or two to kind of put me to sleep, help the issues that you have with trying to work nights and sleep days. And I laid down in bed. I was like, damn, I didn't have anything to drink today. And I was like, hope I'll go to sleep. And the windows were open. It was beautiful. The sun was out. The air was crisp. I hear the lawnmowers going. I hear people getting up, going to work. And I just ended up peacefully drifting off to sleep. And I even usually have the TV on to go to sleep because I think a lot of cops do. It's a hypervigilance issue, but we can get into that later. And I didn't do that either. It was a peaceful morning on September 11th, and I just drifted off to sleep. And about 9 o'clock or so, the phone rings, and it was my sister. And I look over, and the clock says 9:11, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. But my sister and I have a really close relationship, and she knows when I work. She's a nurse, so she knew when I was working nights, and I knew when she was working nights. We wouldn't bother each other. So I knew it was probably something I should pick up the phone and ask her if everything was okay. I did that, and she was like, "Got the TV on?" I'm like, "No, I'm sleeping. You know I'm going to sleep. I worked nights last night." She goes, "You need to put the TV on." I was like, "What's wrong?" She goes, "Put the freaking TV on." And so I put the TV on. I'm like, "Holy crap. We have a problem. This is the morning, September 11th. We already had the planes hit the World Trade Center, and one that was, while I was on the phone with her, hit the Pentagon." And I was like, dang, I got to go to work. She's like, yeah, you better go to work. So that started a different phase of my life and a different trajectory for my career. And ending up at ground zero was certainly impactful, and it's something I take with me forever.
Yeah, you tell that story in your book, and there was something I thought was pretty interesting. When you self-deployed, right? You wake up. That's what young cops do. You're excited. You want to help. You feel like this is my purpose,
Yeah.
and so you gear up. You head into the PD. You run into one of your partners. You go inside and tell that story real quick, because you bring that up a few times in your book, so it clearly had
Had an impact.
yeah, over
Yeah,
time.
when I got to work that morning, after leaving my house, I made a couple phone calls on the way in. It was about 12, should be about almost a 20-minute ride. I think it took me 12 minutes that morning. And I won't say how fast I was going, and the statute of limitations are over anyway. So I pulled into the back parking lot, and at the same time, my partner, my quote unquote partner, my best friend, my squad that I worked with, close with my entire career. But like I said, we didn't have like partners. And we pulled in the parking lot at the same time. And he's like, "You good?" I'm like, "I'm good. Let's get in there and get after it." So we walked into the boss's office together, and patrol lieutenant, and we're like, "All right, Bart and I are here. What are we doing?" He's like, "What do you mean what are we doing? What the hell are you guys doing here? You're midnight guys. It's 9:45 in the morning." And we're like, "Yeah, but like the world's coming to an end, the terrorist attack, whatever the hell is going on. What are we doing to support this?" And I will never be more disparaged or discouraged by the response that we got. And it was literally, this is the quote: "Kid, not our city, not our problem." I literally almost fell to my knees. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked at Bart. Bart looks at me, and we're like, "Oh my goodness, did he just say that?" And he's a very sarcastic, dry humor kind of guy. So at first I thought maybe he was kidding, but now he repeated it again. And for the audience, I think context is important here. And we were about 50 miles south of New York City, where I worked in East Windsor. And we had this high bridge that went over from one side of town to the other, and you could actually see the smoke billowing up from New York City from that high bridge. And but not our city, not our problem. So my partner and I just backed out, like the Homer Simpson meme where he backs into the bushes.
Yeah.
He and I did that
Yeah.
right out of his office,
Yeah.
and we changed our clothes. We put on, instead of PD clothes, we put on union clothing that said East Windsor PBA on it, because that was ours, not theirs. And we put our bags in the car and we drove up there and parked in Jersey City. We were directed, as long as you had a badge, you could get in there. It was blocked off to everybody else. But we parked the car, hopped on a New York City fire boat that was dropping people off coming out of Manhattan, and it brought us back into Manhattan. Uh, it was an interesting experience. I truly believed at that time it was probably a one-way boat ride. I didn't expect to come back from that one. Luckily, we did, and still good and healthy today. I know there are people that are still suffering from things that happened that day, whether it be mentally or physically. I have a good friend that just had a massive brain tumor removed that was 9/11 related, and those diseases keep coming up. So it may still have been a one-way trip for some folks, even 25 years later. So, uh, but yeah,
Yeah.
it was a journey for sure. Um, but since we talk about cop optimization, I think it's important to add a story that happened literally 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago. And to, because I mentioned that we went over on the fireboat, and I hadn't been across the Hudson on a boat since that day. And about 3 weeks ago, my wife was at an event in Jersey City, and for work, she was there for a weekend. So I went up and met her at the hotel Saturday morning, and we didn't have to be anywhere until Saturday evening in Manhattan. So the ferry to go from Jersey City into Manhattan was right at the hotel base. So not even thinking anything about it, we hopped on the ferry and we were going to go across to the city. I can't even tell you, I lost it. As soon as that ferry pulled away and turned around and faced Manhattan, I broke down. I fell apart. I got nauseous. I just lost everything. And she's like, "Oh my God, what's wrong?" I'm like, "I don't know." And then it took me a second to realize that it had been 23 years since I had been on a boat to cross the Hudson to go into New York City. And it all just came, every last bit of that emotion came rushing back. And man, was that an exhausting experience.
Wow.
We just never know when these things come back. We think we've processed things and moved on. Yeah, sometimes it's still there.
Sometimes it's not done with you, right?
Yeah.
Well, that was just I think back now, like to because the way you described that, it was clear in the book that the way your supervisor, you know, said that to you, you've never forgotten it to this day.
Nah.
And so, for young supervisors that are out there, like, he might have been giving you the right advice, like, hey, like maybe you shouldn't go, but the way that he explained it to you, um, you know, I think that's probably the lesson. Like, hey, I get it. We all want to do something. We're all hurting here, but we also have our own city to police, and we've got things here that we're going to have to manage. So let's at least think about what we're doing before we
Yeah.
do it, rather than just not our city, not our problem. Man, that's just so dismissive. Um, it would be interesting to. I don't know if that guy's still around or still with us, but
Unfortunately, he died about a year and a half ago.
I don't know if you ever had a chance to talk to him about that, like later in life, like if he wishes or wonders that if he should have said something differently, or if he would approach that differently, knowing I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm always curious about stuff like that.
I didn't have that conversation with him, but he did soften up over the years. He and I actually had a very good relationship throughout my career. And then he would go on to be the Police Athletic League administrator when he retired from the police department. And so he was working in that civilian capacity. And ironically, he was allergic to bees. And ironically, when he was cutting the grass over there at the baseball fields, he had hit a beehive. And I was fortunate enough to be the one to receive that call for service, and I was able to EpiPen him and save his life. Not that I say that from a heroic standpoint, but the irony standpoint of,
Yeah.
how our relationship started when I was a kid cop and how the last thing I was able to do for him was that. He would go on to, die from lung cancer about 18 months ago, which is terrible. But he was actually a good dude. I just think that, you know, he was hyper focused on what his priorities were for his position. And like you said, didn't explain it appropriately.
Yeah. And, you think about that stuff like over time, it's interesting because, depending on what your role is in the organization, your priorities are different. And, communication is always the
Everything.
number one problem in police
Yeah.
departments is, you either over communicate, you under communicate, you don't communicate at all. So, you do any survey at any police department in America, and the number one complaint that you're going to get is, you know, lack of communication. So, you know,
I think too often we forget where we came from. And one of the experiences that I've witnessed or seen or been a part of is quite often when people move up in either the chain of command or responsibilities or leadership roles, they can happen quite fast. And when you have people that have a goal in mind to get to a certain point by a time in their career, they can maybe not spend enough time in some of the lower roles. And therefore, you kind of lose operational acuity as to what's important in those day-to-day roles in the lower end versus the supervisory administrative end of things. And I think that we have two people or two personalities in our job that don't always necessarily go well together. It's the people that stick around as patrolmen forever, like I did. Then there's the people that, can make it all the way up to the top within a couple of years of their career and just didn't have enough exposure along the way. And for those people, they either do a great job with managing down and they can see below the surface, or they don't. And then that's where your agency runs into leadership issues. So I find it very interesting to watch the dynamics, and everybody's going to be different. But I think we don't spend enough time in our boots on the street as cops.
yeah, that's probably a whole conversation in and of itself. So
Yeah.
maybe we'll come back to that because I do have some I do have a lot of thoughts on that.
No, and it's funny because
Yeah.
you and I, our careers span very differently from that perspective. So I'd love to hear your vision of how you went up and then were able to look down versus me, who always was looking up and never went through a defined leadership role.
Yeah, I mean it's not as complicated probably as you would think. I mean, it's like I spent 10 years as chief, and I got promoted at this to that position at the 17-year mark in my career. So that I did my last 10 years. And I really quite honestly, it wasn't necessarily a planned, like I wasn't
Yeah.
like, hey, someday I want to be chief of police. I never even had that goal. I've there were things that I really enjoyed doing. And, I got moved to spots where I didn't necessarily, no one wants to go from working narcotics to community outreach. But, I was just fortunate. I had good supervisors that, kind of saw some potential in me and forced me to work in some positions that I didn't necessarily want to be in. But then once I got there, I learned a lot.
Those experiences make you who you are as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I tell people like, yeah, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing in a police department, but especially in your smaller to mid-sized agencies, right? Because every position is competitive.
Yeah.
Like, everybody wants to be in these roles. And so when one person doesn't get selected, then, there's not everyone takes the Jocko Willink approach to things like didn't get promoted, good. Time to improve, time to get
Yeah.
better. It's you get a lot, sometimes people are always, looking for, we get into Dweck's work, right? It's like there's always an external, locus of control rather than an internal locus of control. So, managing that and balancing all of those things, excuse me,
Excuse me. Yeah.
it can be challenging. And I'll be honest. I mean, there were times where it just kind of did, whether it's like, get your feelings hurt, or however you want to say it. But, for, young guys that think like, oh, the chief's just up there in the ivory tower. He forgets what it's like out here. I would have guys like that have been on the job for like 5 or 6 years saying shit like that. Like,
Yeah, they don't have enough time for that.
like, dude, like, I was like, I have
Yeah.
underwear in patrol. I hate saying things like that, but it gets to, it is kind of true. Like, it's like I spent my first 12 years in patrol, like 12 years on night shift, like on not a day shift, all night shift. So I didn't go to an afternoon shift until like I got promoted to sergeant, and I wanted to be on nights, but they made me go to afternoons, and I eventually made it back to nights. But yeah, it was something like that. I can't remember the exact time frame, but so so it can be a little frustrating. But at the same time, you also get it. You kind of like, hey, I get it. When I was there, like sometimes you feel like when management's not listening to you, that they've forgotten where they've come from. Then you get on the other side of it, and then you realize, well, I've got a whole other set of issues that I have to manage in
Absolutely.
addition to that. So it's all about perspective. But no, I mean, I think you're right though. You always, you need to approach, and this is just my opinion, right? Because we can say things like patrol is the backbone of the agency. Every role in the police department is important. That's
Agreed.
why it's there. So you can't necessarily say one is more important than the other. They're both important, and so you have to focus on what the overall mission is. Like, what is our purpose here? What's our why? Like, we're here to drive community safety, and that means we've got to have a multifaceted approach to what we're doing. Yeah, patrol is the largest part of that. So one of the things that, and I'll just tell you, I'll just give you a story. Like, so I had a couple of big projects towards the end of my career. Adopting a new body camera, in dash camera. Then going to a new CAD and RMS system, from a legacy system that we had for like close to 20 years. And then a new building, like it was like, $55 million,
Wow.
public safety building project. But when we were looking at the CAD and the RMS system, from a technology perspective, and the team that we put together, researching that, what I told them was, as you're doing this, as we're looking at this new CAD and RMS system, I want it to integrate with other tools. We want to simplify processes as much as we can. We see this convergence of technology coming. But you have to think about the patrolman sitting in the squad car. That's where I want you to start. Like, our job is to make them as efficient and as effective as we can, not to burden them with administrative tasks that make our job as administrators easier.
Yeah.
So, finding things like auto translation and CAD integration, tools like that simplify processes. That you know that was the end goal in mind. So I was successful, in the technology I think that we did. So, but sometimes, it came at a cost. Being an early adopter, looking at some of these things, it came with frustrations. So, I get it. But I can say with a good, clear conscience that that was always my goal, was to try to you know, and I made some notes in your book too, because you talked about, and I'll go back, one of the first projects I was involved in, very similar to you, right? Uh, got into a fight, and what happened? What happened with your holster? Or you got into a foot chase, right?
Got into a foot chase, yeah, with kid's name was Abe. Uh, I was still on FTO at the time, and so my equipment was brand new. The leather wasn't broken in yet, and we had these level one retention holsters that had nothing but a snap on them, a thumb brake. And
Yep.
the at some point during the foot chase, the thumb brake broke open, the snap came undone, and that leather piece just kind of flaps right back up to where it wanted to be when it was crushed in the packaging. And there's no other retention in that holster, and my gun popped out in the middle of a foot chase. I never knew it. That was a real trip when we got to the suspect, we called him, went to go put him in handcuffs. My FTO, my partner, was like covered down on him, and I went to go grab my gun, and it wasn't there. Um, that was a real trip.
Yeah, I felt the sinking in my stomach for
Yeah,
you when I read that, like, oop, because I've been there.
yeah.
A little
And
different,
most of the
little
time that
different, but
happens when we've been to a Sally Port or something like that at a neighboring agency or the county jail, and you leave your gun in the gun locker in somebody else's garage. Uh, but yeah, we had been on the road all night, and I was like, oh boy. And the greatest part was, you got to improvise sometimes, right? And so I pull out my expandable PR-24 for the side handle baton, and I use that as a long gun to point it at him upside down. And my partner looks at me, my FTO looks at me, and he's like, gives me this like, what is going on here? And he just starts laughing. And the suspect looks down at my hand, starts laughing. And the three of us had a good chuckle. And as we tied him up in a pretzel and walked him back through the woods to the car. And yeah, it was interesting. So when I went to go write that report, my boss at the time, who wasn't a sergeant yet, but he was the officer in charge of the shift. And I told him, like, how do I write this? He goes, 3 words, never happened, bro. And we did eventually find my gun in the woods. We traced it back and found it. But man, that was wild.
yeah, yeah. Every cop I think has similar stories. Anyone that's carried a gun in their career, I mean, it's yeah. I've had a few. I'll have to tell those stories one of these days. Um, yeah, one. I'll give the audience a teaser on one of these. So once was I had to go to court in the middle of the day, right? My wife was at work. I had two small boys at the time, so I'm waking up like just in a hurry to get things done, whatever. But I just remember like I set a couple of items on the roof of my car,
Mm, been there.
and one of them stayed, one of them didn't. And at the moment I realized, like, I remember pulling over the side of the road going, please, 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 please be there. Please, God, please. So anyway, going into my deputy chief's office afterwards, um, he was like, Flannelly, what do you want? I was like, well, sir, I have good news and bad news. And he was like, oh, shit. He's like, give me the good news. And I said, I don't need a new firearm, sir. And he was like, Liz leans back in his chair and he's like, well, thank God for that. What's the bad news? I'm like, well, I am going to need a new cell phone. This back in the old days. Like, um, yeah. Anyway, I
That's funny.
digress. So, so let's move. We've been going for a while here. I know this always happens. Like it gets easy to get sidetracked. Um, so after this experience at 9/11, being at ground zero, those are, speaking of sights, sounds, smells, feels, things that are never going to leave you. Um, you're progressing through your career. Um, what's, yeah, I guess we can maybe skip forward a little bit, but you meet your wife. You have kids. Maybe touch on that just a little bit, some of the highlights there, because I want to get towards the point where I think the audience is waiting for. Like,
So my wife and I met at a wedding, and it was one of those things where I was the only single guy at the wedding, and there was a whole table of single girls, and I was like, yeah, I'll take that one. And it worked out well. We ended up having kids, three of them, which I'm really proud of them. I have one going to college this coming fall, and one another one in high school, and then in middle school we're going. Sorry, elementary school going into middle school in the fall. And we've had a pretty incredible life, and I will tell you that my family has been the backbone and support of my entire law enforcement career. The ups and the downs, um, the personality issues that have developed over time, and you know, I always say that I'm grateful that I started the job before I met my wife and had a family, because they met the current version of me, where if you get married and potentially have a family before you get into law enforcement or any other first responder roles, you do change. You change over time. And that initial phase, probably the first 5 years, is when you're going to change the most, prior to, then retirement's another big change. And if you get married before you start the job, they're marrying a different person because the job does change you. And I'm just grateful that I met my wife and had a family after I had some time in the job, and realized the new version of me. They didn't have to change with me. And that change over time was slower versus that initial, I'm out of the academy, I'm a different person now. And I think that's where a lot of our relationships go sideways as cops or as first responders, is because it's two different worlds, the before and the after. But yeah, my family's been the backbone for me. They've been there every time I've fallen down to get me back up again. And I don't think we give the families in our jobs enough credit, to be quite honest with you. And we always work very hard at our well-being to give our communities the best version of ourselves. But I think we fail when we come home and we don't give our families the best version of ourselves. When, I've heard people say that, oh, you should tell your spouse that if you've had a bad day, just to leave you alone and see you in the morning. Man, that is the worst thing that you can do for somebody, is because if somebody needs to be alone, it means they need to be with you. And I think that we don't talk about those family relationships enough. That job will be there. Your seat, if you get fired tomorrow or quit tomorrow or whatever tomorrow, they're going to fill that seat before got even cold. But your family, they're the ones that'll be there for you forever. And we need to make sure that we're bringing that support home to them, the support that they're giving us.
Yeah, I mean that's well, we should probably do another episode at some point and just talk about that. But um, I think the interesting thing about, I mean, there's a lot of things that we could cover there, but I think about Kevin Gilmartin's work, and just early in my career, we had a sergeant that had seen his work and brought had the chief bring him to our city, and had everybody, this is, and I give him a lot of credit because he was way ahead of his time, and I was more of a SWAT and attack guy at the time. So it was like, what is this? What is this emotional survival for law enforcement BS? But after seeing him, having him present, I was like, oh, okay, yeah. And then reading his book, this is important stuff. Like that was probably my first real, like, I mean, I had given some consideration to emotional well-being and really from and how it was attached to the physical side, but seeing him present, like this was not long after his book was published, so it was very early on in his speaking career. And I mean, been very fortunate with the group that I work with, Dr. Jim Greenwald, out of Specialty Health in Reno, who's good friends with Kevin Gilmartin, through a program we call, insulin resistance and the first responder. We call it The Blood Doesn't Lie, but, I've gotten to present that with Kevin Gilmartin on the back end of my career. So everything has kind of come full circle. I just say all that because, when he talks about the magic chair, and just kind of that change, um, I don't, I don't necessarily know that I personally experienced any of that, but I certainly recognized it in a lot of people that I worked with. Um, it probably for me, that type of, emotional load didn't hit me from a patrol and a work perspective. It was more later in my career as a chief and as a supervisor, when you're managing other people and you're managing, like the emotions of discipline and accountability and things like that when you're, especially in the post-Ferguson world and that in that George Floyd
Right.
environment. But yeah, your family is, that's the one thing, like sadly, and I do think things have turned, you don't see the divorce rates as high, but it's,
They're
you know,
still up there,
yeah, they're
but
still high.
definitely not as bad as it was.
Well, and then, the thing that I keep pounding the drum on, right, is like even after going out to the White House and, taking part in those listening sessions for the 21st Century Policing Initiative, we have identified this six pillar officer safety and wellness, and we're now 10 years beyond that work, and obesity rates in law enforcement are as high as they've ever been. Cardiovascular disease rates are as high as they've ever been. And sadly, suicide rates have been as high as they've ever been. So it just seems to me like awareness hasn't necessarily moved us as far as we need to go. And there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, I
And
would agree with you there. I think we've actually done, I think, a pretty good job with the awareness piece. And there's a lot of people out there, just talking about their stories and stuff like that, but we're not doing a good enough job giving the tools out.
yeah,
And I think those tools need to come before the trauma happens, before the problems that take place, because we need something to fall back on. And not for everybody, it's religion, or spirituality, I should say, which is different than religion. But I think we're not giving people the right tools at an earliest stage in their career. And therefore, by the time they've ended up in trouble, it's much harder to get them up out of that hole.
yeah. So let's get to the good part here.
It's all good parts, man.
I know. It is good. So you're at, and like, this is, I think, such an important conversation. You're at the end of your career, really, quite frankly. You're at the 18, 19-year mark. You feel like, like you recognize, you're the guy that was always, hey, I wrote up a new proposal to get, triple retention holsters, and you've always been on the front end of, being a problem solver, getting things done. And you did, it sounds like you did not have support throughout the agency, and maybe even, quite frankly, some people that were working against you for personal reasons, not being very professional. And it just kind of puts you in a bad place, and then you get involved in the story about the body camera, and it almost seemed absurd to me when I was reading that. So I don't know, I was
It
like,
was absurd going through it.
is there something I'm missing here? Like,
Nah, it's just, it's funny. As a blessing and a curse, I guess, one of the things that I found throughout the course of my career is I was always too far ahead of the game. And the things that I would come up with, or the ideas that I had, were too far on the fringe of what could be or what's possible or what may be in the future. And I think that our agency, which was so stuck in the past, I mean, we didn't have computers in the car till like 2017.
really?
Yeah,
Wow.
we're an antiquated place. You drive through the town and it looks like 1972. Like it's the main philosophy, which, by the way, this burns me up, is when you ask somebody why we're doing something this way, it's the way we've always done it. Like, there's nothing worse you can say to me than that. And it's the place was bizarre, and I was just, too far ahead of the game. Like, I was early on in trying to put the agency or the PBA on social media and tell the world about the great things that we were doing to kind of combat the crap that the news media was putting out there, because we were struggling with relationships within our community for no good reason than what they saw on, MSNBC or CNN or Fox. And how do you combat that without a different message? And we weren't putting out any message. And it was a challenge. So that's just one example. But yeah, so I always struggled with the fact that I was too forward thinking and how I wanted things to change or look different. And therefore, not only were my ideas rejected, I was rejected as a person because I was just seen as, out of touch for what we were doing. I also feel in some level that I was probably threatening to certain people that wanted to get promoted or get a title or get a position, that they always felt like that my creativity or ingenuity was going to prevent them from doing that. So I was not the greatest at my social relationships within the agency, and I allowed some of the negativity to get the better of me, and I became sour, and I just started doing nothing. And then the whole body camera incident happened, which was really nothing. It was a piece of broken equipment that turned into be a major catastrophe. But when I realized that they saw it as an avenue to fire me and get rid of me, which I didn't get fired, by the way, but I think that was the intent behind it, that I felt like it was all over. And that was the end. And there was no way that I could have stomached the humility of being fired in a career that I loved and put every piece of my being into. And that's kind of where everything started going south for me. And it was just time to go, time to move on.
So, I mean, I think it's important to tell this part of the story, right? Like where you actually you got disciplined. You tell, and I don't want to give away the book, right? But because I do want everyone to read it. And this is the part where I was telling, I was saying in the beginning, like where actually, it was I got those wet eyes in my car because you're talking about, in that moment where you are driving home and you make this decision like, hey, I'm going to pull into this parking lot. I'm going to, you almost repeating what you had seen and early in your career, like, hey,
Yeah.
here's the exit, here's the plan. Tell that story if you don't mind.
Yeah. Throughout the IA process for the body camera situation, when I realized that what I believed their plan to be, I couldn't, there was no way I could have managed that humiliation. And only because, not only because, but it was the job was everything to me. It was my identity. It's also, I worked in the town I grew up in, so I was a known entity that was the police officer that grew up in that town. And there was no way I could have moved forward. So I decided that ending my life was the solution. And I had a plan and it was all good to go. I was going home from midnights and the phone rings as I'm about to pull into I'm sitting at a red traffic light prior to pulling into the parking lot where I plan to manage through this. And it was my son who was just saying good morning, and he wanted to know if I was on my way home, if he'd seen me in the morning before he went off to school. And the conversation was about 7 minutes long, and I had driven past the place where I planned to take my own life, and when I hung up the phone with him, realized I was about 5 minutes from home, and I just kept driving and went home. And that window of time, by the grace of something or someone, in this case was my son, pulled me through that window, that open window that we have that really short period of time where decisions like that can be altered. And he was the one that altered it and has no idea. He doesn't know that that story exists. I've never talked to him about it. He's now 17. And someday he'll read it in the book and recognize why our relationship is what it is and why certain things, affect me in the way that they do. And when it comes to him. So, uh, I look forward to someday when he's mature enough and is ready for that conversation to have it with him. But yeah, he saved my life, and I went home that day like nothing ever happened. And when I lied down in bed that morning after everybody left the house, I never felt more peaceful and more alive as I drifted off to sleep.
Yeah. So, man, so I'll tell you, like, just probably a week before I read that in your book, I don't know if you listened to the Sean Ryan show, but I was listening to his podcast, and he had on a guy named Blake Cook, who was a police officer in North Carolina, who, and Sean Ryan has been very open about, his experience with, trying to commit suicide but failing. And then Blake Cook talked about, he also grew up in a very troubled home, like, difficult childhood, but got to a point where, he was also thinking about almost, I mean, it's eerily similar to your story, but when he was, and at that moment where he was getting ready to do it, his phone rang and he picked up the phone and it was someone like, hey, how are you? I need you to do a job for me. And it made him think forward and think past. And it wasn't until later where he came back and reflected on that moment. You're like, well, that phone call and that timing, it saved his life. So for me to hear two stories in one week where, my fellow brothers in blue are like having their lives saved by calls. It was just, I'm not gonna lie, like it was a very emotional experience, and I it's again, it just goes to show that we do have a lot of work to do, and I do think there's great programs out there. I'm involved with some of them. I'm a big believer in my work and what I'm doing with Dr. Greenwald and our insulin resistance program, because we now have really really good data that shows the metabolic link to mental illness, and if we can improve somebody's blood markers, then generally we can improve their overall disposition, mental, physical, and emotional health. So a lot of work to be done there. But
I
you
really
know,
appreciate what you had told me that story the other day, and I really appreciate those novel scientific approaches to these just really unique ways to understand how the body and mind are connected.
yeah,
And I've explored some of those as well from a more social science perspective. And what I always come back to though is sometimes it's just as simple as that phone call.
yeah,
And do the buddy checks, check in with your people. You just never know. You may be the one. You may be that one call that saves somebody's life. And the truth is, like, no one else may be calling them. No one else may be looking after them. So be the one. And with my buddy Danny, I kind of go back to that story as well, and just be the one, because nobody else may be doing it. And that call could save somebody's life. And it doesn't have to be when they're in crisis. Call anytime. Just check in with
right.
the folks.
Yeah, and so now you're retired, and you talked early in the episode here about those first 6 months and how you really struggled. And I think that's, a lot of cops, they're dying in those first 5 years when they retire,
Yeah,
because, their identity is attached to their profession, and what they did, and not necessarily, not recognizing who they are. And that's not necessarily healthy. But I will say it is interesting, right? Like, we used to kind of like internally, some of the initiatives that we had, when I was chief, we started a police foundation. One of the things that we were early on, like one of my first goals with that foundation was to be able to generate funds to be able to have a retirement ceremony where we could actually hand out plaques, because the way state law is in Indiana, and the way the state board of accounts works, I mean, like, you can't buy certain things. You just can't go out and buy a plaque for somebody, because you're violating a budget law. And as a young officer, I never understood things like that. And it's just, well, why can't we just, like, I'm control, it's like, I got a $22 million budget and I can't buy a freaking $100 plaque. It just seemed kind of ridiculous. But so you have initiatives like that where, all right, we start a foundation, the community wants you, they support you, they love you. And they're there for you, right? And they also are
absolutely.
going they want to hold you accountable if you screw up. But for the most part, the squeaky wheel, they're not the problem. Uh, yeah, I mean, I guess to my point, like, having these, like, it was just kind of cool to be able to have a ceremony where we could rent a room, a really nice a room, have a catered dinner, and invite like the retirees in, and invite their families in. But I'll be I'm going to be honest here. Um, some of those have gone really well, but one of the more disappointing things that I have to say was, you put a lot of effort into that, because prior to that, like, if you want to have a retirement party for someone, guys pitched in like $10, $20, $30, $50. You buy a plaque, you get but that was it. Like,
Yeah.
that's all you got. You 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, you walk out the door with your duty weapon and nothing, quite frankly, and unless someone bought you a plaque. And so we were able to step that up, but even then, like, just not a lot of participation. A lot of guys didn't come to those ceremonies. Even though there was, before that, they would say, oh, it's like, I don't know. I don't want to get too far down that road, but the the flip side to that is like when retirees would retire, like you'd never see them again. It's like, where'd you guys go? Like they don't come back to the PD. You don't see them around. So, we started thinking like, hey, well, let's invite them back to, events that we're having. But I didn't understand it when I was working. I did not understand it, like why people don't come back. And then I retire, and like when you're gone, you're right. It's like there's always a few people that you stay in touch with, but
Mhm.
it's kind of weird. You feel weird going back.
Yeah, and
I was just
there's
down there
always
the
this
other day.
disconnect. There's
Yeah.
this weird disconnect, and it, I feel like I aged 10 years socially when I walked out the door to the next morning when I woke up. And because I had gone back a couple times for one reason or another, and you look at the people that are there and they're like, man, these are just kids. And I just think that there's something different about the other side of that threshold. When you walk out of it for the last time, you become the beginning of a new chapter again.
Yep.
And you, until you've crossed that threshold yourself, there's just this weird barrier between both sides of that. And yeah, there's not a bridge there. We should build one. We should figure out how it works. I agree.
Yeah.
I
I
would
think
love to go
we,
back, but you're just not welcomed. It's just weird. It's weird.
Yeah, isn't that it is such a bizarre feeling. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I guess I was a chief, right? So I'm sure there's some people that didn't want me back, right? There's some that probably like, I don't care if I ever see that guy again. But I also know there's a lot of people that, I still get along great with. I see them all the time. I text, I chat, they call me from time to time. So it's different when you physically, and I go down there now quarterly, and this is a building that I designed, right? So it's kind of bizarre. I retired. I got to stand in what would have been my office prior to retirement and look out, over the city. It's kind of a cool experience. But it was, the building wasn't built for me, right? It was built for the next 30 years. Um, and I'm good with that. But I will say it's kind of weird. I was just down there the other day. I'm working on a project, and talking with someone I worked with for a long time, and it's kind of weird walking around in that building. Seeing. Actually, I walked by early in my career. I was a crime scene photographer, but I was just a hobby photographer as well. And I did a couple of the uh, the portraits, the composites. I did individuals, and then the agency composites. So walking by a composite that I actually did, it was like, this is kind of weird. After being gone for, when you're working and you're in there and you see it all the time, you don't even think twice of it. But like when you've been gone, like I've been retired for not quite 3 years yet, but it's coming up, and yeah. So yeah, for those listening, don't I guess it's don't feel like you're an oddball if you feel like a little left out or you feel a little kind of alienated from it all. I think it's kind of
It's
natural.
normal.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, for those that are, when you're still working, like my successor as chief, he's doing a great job with programs like that. Like he invites retirees back to our annual shift
It's
bid and
important to
gets
keep
people
people
into
connected.
the swearing in
100%.
ceremonies, stuff like that. Like, that was always one of my more enjoyable things. You swear in a new officer. We started to do it where you'd swear one in, and you would recognize also the officers in the room that were getting ready to retire. So you kind of had this interesting
Yeah,
juxtaposition.
that's great connection.
But I also wanted to mention one other thing because you mentioned the name earlier, Bessel van der Kolk. The body keeps score. One of the initiatives that, and speaking of Kevin Gilmartin and family, for swearing in ceremonies, like that's a big deal. Like I remember when I got sworn in, it was like I was in the mayor's office and I signed a piece of paper. They, raised my right hand. Yeah, and there was a couple people there. We left. It was, I was just excited and happy as hell to have the job, but it wasn't, when I became chief, and we actually started this before I was chief, so it was not necessarily my initiative, but we kind of tried to build on it as we went. We have this amazing man that lives in our city. His name's Dr. Will Miller, and he's from Manhattan. He grew up in New York. He was a comedian. Grew up in the 60s, a Vietnam vet, but he actually toured with people like Jerry Seinfeld and those.
That's awesome.
So later in life, he becomes he's got his master's degree in psychology, and we're right here at Purdue University. He has an experience. He's a pastor at a church. He's also teaches at Purdue. He's standing out in front of their church. They're close to a fire station. He's on the sidewalk, and down he goes. Has the big one. And a fireman and a policeman are there. They see him. They grab an AED. They run it over. They bring him back to life. And
Hmm.
you know, he has a whole stand-up routine about this now too, where he talks about, no, I didn't see any light, anything like that. It's
That's
kind
so
of fun.
funny.
But he since then has dedicated his life to really helping police officers and first responders, deal with trauma. I'm going to have him on one of these days, and he's got his own podcast. It's really cool. But I say that because what we started doing, and this is just an idea I float out there for others, on the day that we would have our swearing in ceremonies, we make a big presentation of it. We do it in the council chambers. We invite family and friends and loved ones. We get as many people there as we can. We give the family the tour, the PD, and we host them for a luncheon. And then at the luncheon, Dr. Will Miller comes and speaks at the luncheon, and we give the families, not just the officers, but we also give the families a copy of Kevin Gilmartin's book, The Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. And Dr. Miller talks to them about, hey, here's what your loved one is doing, like this noble profession. Here's what they're going to experience, but here's what we want you to know in advance. Like,
Hmm.
you're going to see changes. This is an inevitable part of the process, but we want you to recognize these signs, and we want you to have all of this information up front so that when you do start to see these things, it's not.
It's
Yeah,
normal.
it's yeah, but yeah, he tells this great joke too about, like, Kevin Gilmartin, why the magic chair, and then talks about, he talks about Robert Sapolsky a lot, who I'm sure you're probably familiar with, but why zebras don't get ulcers. And uh, anyway,
Yes.
I digress. So all of these things are important. Like, what's if you call it a pre-workout routine, we're talking kind of like a pre-career routine. How do you prepare somebody for this stress? But the last thing I want to touch on here, and we can finish this up here over the next like 10 to 15 minutes, is, in what you've done post that moment, and now what you're doing to help others, maybe not, experience the same fate that you did, hopefully prevent, getting that close to the edge like you did, maybe taking that one step too far. But you, in our pre-call, you mentioned, when you went back, you went to the University of Penn and worked with, when you were getting your master's degree, working with Dr. Seligman. You wrote the book Flourish, which I read, I think, for the first time, probably close to 20 years ago. Just amazing seminal work. Can you talk about what you're doing now, and, your work in positive psychology, building resiliency, and why it's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the 30-second prelude to that would be important as well. When I was first went through that training class to be a resiliency officer for the state of New Jersey, when we started that program here, that's what introduced me to the concepts of positive psychology and the science of resiliency. And it was because of that class that I read Flourish as well. And in that book, Marty talks about a program he started. Now it's 20 years. They're in MAP 20 now. Masters of Applied Positive Psychology, a program he started in 2004, I guess. Positive psychology was coined, that phrase, in 2000 when he was the president of the American Psychological Association. And then they built this program out in 2004 at Penn. And so I read that in the book, and I was like, dang, I need to know more about that. And my wife had gone to Penn for undergrad, so we're close to the university, and we're, part of the university community. And I was like, wow, it'd be really cool if I could get into that. So I did apply, and I did not get in the first go around. I did get in the second though, and I spent the year there getting my master's under Marty, and he's my personal mentor, and continued to uh, that relationship and working on some things together now as well. And I can't tell you the impact that that program had on me. And gratuitously, I say that I'm the only, I'm one of two police officers that have ever graduated from that program, and the only one in this country. The other one was the chief of police in Mumbai, India.
Wow.
So I don't really, as grateful as I am for his work that he does there, it's not comparable to me, or not relatable, I should say, to me. So,
Relatable, yeah.
um, yeah, I'm the only police officer in this country that's ever gone through that program and gotten that degree. And there is one FBI agent that's been through. There's been a Coast Guard swimmer. There's a few other people that are in our related line of work, but it's mostly people that are in the psychological fields. Um, but so, yeah, so that was an incredible experience, and it changed my life. It set me on this path that I'm on today of developing programs and resiliency tools and trainings for law enforcement, other first responders, and even veteran communities. And I can't express the impact. I can't express enough the impact that these tools have, and even such simple ones. Talking about the science of gratitude, talking about just the three blessings exercise that Dr. Emmons and Dr. Ubermersky put together years ago, and how just such a simple thing of writing down the three things you're grateful for each day, whether when you wake up or when you go to sleep, how that changes your mindset, not only for the day or for the moment, but for time going forward after you've been doing it long enough. Gratitude journals, the whole idea of gratitude, and Dr. Emmons, who's out in California at UC Davis, I believe, is the leading researcher on gratitude. And the work that he's done towards that, while it seems so simple, right? But obviously the science behind it is a lot more complex. But doing those little things is what I would suggest to the new officer, or even the old officer, but we're having a discussion about new officers.
Yeah.
How do I make sure that I don't lose myself in this job? How do I make sure that I stay between the guardrails and don't get off track and lose the sense of who I am as a person in this crazy career that we're in? And the little things about just understanding what you're grateful for each day will keep you centered, will keep you grounded. And I don't think you'll get to those moments that I had when you realized that all you had was bad stuff, because it's not true, because you can go back on the gratitude pieces. So that would be the one takeaway that I would give to younger officers and even retirees, because when we retire, that's another big transition, right? And we got to figure out how we move forward. And we do lose a lot of people. And one of the stats that always bothers me is uh, the average person that lives, I shouldn't say the average person, a person who's not in law enforcement that lives beyond the age of 50 lives an average of another 30 to 35 years. A police officer beyond the age of 50, the average lifespan is 7.8 years. That's not okay for me. It's not enough time to get back the pension I put into,
I'm
to make
knocking
that
on
have
wood.
worthwhile. So it's, yeah, if 7.8 years is not long enough
No, it's not.
so we got to do better. And, those numbers, a lot of that comes from suicide, which we don't really even know so much about at this point, that the data is not great. Karen Solomon of Blue Help is doing a much better job with that than we've ever done before, but the data is not awesome. Our data is great, just we're not there yet. And, the stress that we have over the course of our careers gives us greater exposure to cardiovascular disease and the insulin stuff that you were talking about earlier. And our bodies are just breaking down because we've put it under such stress for so long with no break, that when we do give it that break, it just collapses. And that's where we're getting that 7.8 years from. So I think when we instill these other tools, these positive psychology tools, and there's a ton of them out there, we could go 5 hours more on just talking about a handful of positive interventions. They're those tools are accessible. So we need to go beyond the awareness piece that we were speaking about earlier and start talking about the tools. Because I think everybody gets it. But now what are we doing about it?
Yeah. Well, do you have a few more minutes? Can we talk about some of those?
100%.
Okay. Well, let's take a just a quick little pause, and then we're gonna get into some of these. Okay. So thinking about what can we do? What are some of these? What are some of the things that you would recommend? Let's just say for an individual officer, and then maybe an organization. Like, what can we do to turn the tide? Because that 8 years, that's not good. Like
No,
that's way too short. You spend all this time. I like to use the expression like hire healthy, retire healthy, optimize in between, and then bankrupt our pension funds because we live long,
I agree.
lives,
That's a good problem to
post
have.
retirement. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. No, there's so I think there's a lot of different things we can do. I think some of them are more complex than others. On the simple side, I think we can have these resiliency courses, and I reluctantly use that word because it's become such a buzzword and it's become such a pop culture word. But the science behind resiliency is really magnificent. And Karen Rivich and Judy Salzberg, they are the heads of the Penn Resiliency Program that is put out through. I mean, it's been through so many different types of organizations. On the law enforcement side, we've used it through IACP, and it's been a real big success. So they are the brain children behind the resiliency science, and they do a great job with that. They actually wrote a book called The Resiliency Factor, which I highly recommend. So teaching these resiliency courses, I think, is super important. We can talk about things like active constructive responding. And while that is maybe not the best for you, it's the best for the person that's talking to you, right? So using soft skills like that to be able to make others feel better. And one of the founders of positive psychology alongside Dr. Seligman was a guy named Chris Peterson. And his big phrase was other people matter. And I think when we go into our jobs, into our lives, thinking like that, especially in leadership roles, that other people matter, not only are we benefiting others, we're always also increasing our own well-being, because when we can help other people succeed, it makes us feel good. So I think little things like that, and they're little things, but high impact, right? So I think if we start with resiliency classes, we start giving each other the tools on how to listen well, how to treat our bodies well, how to take breaks, putting the pause between situations. I'm a big fan of practicing the pause. That started out as a mindfulness thing. And I think we don't have to look at it from this mindfulness or meditation guru type philosophy. The medical community is using it as a 5-second practice the pause meditation before the doctor walks into a room to have a conversation with a patient. They literally put their hand on the door frame, count to 5, and then walk into the room. Like, that's enough to reset you and put you into that next phase, the next moment. But I think as cops, we need to practice the pause between work and home. And I think that will also create this great bubble or this buffer by separating the two. And you can do that in a variety of ways. You can listen to music on the way home. You can hit the gym before you get home, or hit the gym before you go to work. Putting a break, a pause between the two biggest pieces of your life, which is work and home, I think is a really effective way of increasing your well-being in both of those environments, because you're creating this sense of you, this moment of, not want to sound foofy, but this moment of Zen almost,
Yeah.
however you come to that, between those two factors. So I think that's something we can discuss, and tools we can use. For me, my research for graduate school was in using the humanities towards emotional regulation and coping in law enforcement. It had a really big impact on me, understanding how visual art, literary art, and music art can be an effective tool towards coping and well-being. And I think we don't do enough of that in the law enforcement world. And when we talk about music, which I'll only keep in for a second, because I think there's some negative aspects we use in music towards emotional regulation. I can't tell you how many non-urban folks that I had throughout my career that listened to some of like this hardcore gangster rap shit at 3 a.m. I was like, dude, you're a country boy. Like, what are you really? And I'm not trying to say one's better than the other, but this is just not you. Like, it's just weird. I've never seen you relate to the messages or the style of music before. What are you doing? He goes, well, I want to understand the people that I'm dealing with at 3 a.m. on the street, what they're talking about. I want to understand their language. I want to understand how they're feeling. I'm like, well, that's great, but this is probably then not the time to be listening to that, because a lot of it is anti-police related, and you're going to get out of the car pissed off and fired up. And what's the first thing that's going to happen when you come across somebody? You're going to beat the shit out of them. And it's not going to be a conscious reaction. It's going to be a subconscious one, because you're emotionally keyed up on something that's pissing you off. Now you're getting out of the car and dealing with somebody that you find relatable to that music. So this is not a great way for emotional regulation. Like, this is the opposite. This is the red tape version of what you need to be doing. So
maybe in the weight room, right?
Exactly. So there's obviously negative aspects to that, which I want to just put out there and put aside, because I want to keep it positive, right? But visual art I have found to be extremely impactful, and so impactful that the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum in Washington, D.C. just did an Officers as Artists exhibit that's going to be going on for the next year. I'm grateful that I was able to incorporate that in some of my research and be part of that process to help that down there. And the art that is in the exhibit, I think that we had 150 something pieces submitted. There's 75 on display. And it's not all police stuff. It's not all, SWAT pictures of, whatever that guy that did those pencil drawings years ago. Forget his name that everybody had.
Oh, yeah, Kramer.
Kramer, yeah, exactly right. So some of it is not police related at all, but it's all made by cops, and it's an expression of the person's emotion at the time they made the art. And it's all storytelling. So whether it's visual art, whether it's the written word, anything that is both an expressive and a receptive form of communication and storytelling, I think is really, really, really effective in emotional regulation. And that can go from the guy or girl that's first starting the job, to the person that's midway through their career, all the way up through retirement and retirees. And obviously in retirement, we have more time to do something that's more creative and more expressive from ourselves and tell our own stories. And that's what we have hanging on those walls down there in the museum. And I think that storytelling is such an amazing way to bridge gaps between communities of people or individuals themselves. And I think the best person in my life that describes that is Scott Mann, who is a retired lieutenant colonel of Green Beret. He actually just wrote a new book that talks about his experience in storytelling as a Green Beret. And he does such a great job of laying
Nobody's coming to save you.
Nobody's coming to save you. Yep, that one's it. And he does such an amazing job of talking about building those bridges between his team of Green Berets and these Afghan villagers that had nothing in common. But you find a gap, you find this bridge to pull these people together, you and another group, or your group and another group, or you and one other person. And storytelling is the way. And for some people, that may be through visual art. So when we put these art pieces in the museum and people that are not cops are coming in there, they're able to see the emotions of the person that made the picture. They're getting a piece of that person's story. And the same thing with literature. It's, book writing. That worked for me, right? Obviously, I wrote a book and it was impactful for me, and I was able to tell my story in that way. I can't draw worth a shit, so the book was it. And I can't sing either, so music was out too. But I
can't sing. It doesn't stop me from singing, though.
And my wife stops me from singing, so it's all good. But there's two main forms of storytelling. There's the transportation narrative, the journey that you're bringing somebody along with you. And Then there's the healing version of narrative. And some people may see your story as a path forward for themselves. And again, whatever form that comes in, whether it's visual art, literary, music, performing arts as well, theater, I think as cops, as first responders, we don't dig into that enough. And subconsciously, maybe because we have to use emotion to kind of feel things in a way that we may not want to in our roles in our world. But my belief is that that is a great path forward towards emotional regulation. Now, going back to Dr. Seligman's work, specifically in Flourish, he talks about his theory of well-being, which is PERMA, the acronym PERMA, which is positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. When you put those 5 pillars in play, the humanities builds on all 5 of those. That then gives us the best foundation that I can think of to raise our well-being status. And the biggest one with the humanities is relationships. When you go to a museum, and I'm not a museum guy, or I wasn't anyway until I started doing all this, and you're looking at art, it may mean something completely different to you than it means to the person standing next to you, and have absolutely nothing to do with the person that made it. So everybody sees a different story. But now you're talking to people, maybe someone you didn't know, and building that high quality connection with somebody you've never met before. It happens to be standing next to you. Or maybe it's a spouse that you haven't had a great relationship over the last couple of years, and now you're building this relationship over a piece of art. Or maybe a child that you want to teach something new to, and you can do it through that visualization of the picture hanging on the wall. Or go with as a squad. Go to a museum that's relatable to you guys. Go to the National Law Enforcement Officers Museum in DC, or go to some place that's more local to wherever you are, and have those conversations about crap that doesn't matter, and just build relationships with people. And maybe as a training event, instead of doing the next low light shooting thing that somebody came up with 2 weeks ago, and it's the new next best thing, put out paper, pencil, and crayons for 2 hours and just let people draw and see what they come up with, and then talk about it. Now, that will breed a sense of accomplishment that they made this cool picture, whatever it is. It'll build relationships with your squad. It will express something that's meaningful to them, to the rest of the group. And it engages people in the room, and ultimately brings up positive emotion with everybody. So there are these different things. Again, to me, the humanities piece is huge. But there's just a ton of different tools out there. I know I've gone on a long time, and
No, that's great.
what are your thoughts?
I was letting you riff because going back to music, and like I've always, I took a couple years of photography in high school, so photography has always just kind of been a hobby of mine. I was a crime scene photographer early in my career, but that just kind of led to some of the desire to want to do nature photography. So you can't see it, but right above me is one of my favorite images in the world. It's from Thomas Mangelson, who's a wildlife photographer. If you've never seen Thomas Mangelson's work, I went with one of my coworkers and another lifelong friend. We went on a backpacking trip up in the Grand Tetons, and so it's kind of like one thing leads to another. Is my point is like my desire to do some wildlife and outdoor photography led me to finding the works of him through a walk through the mountains that I'd never been in, that got me out of nature. And it was really even back then that I just recognized like how much that helped me, like how much better I felt after doing stuff like that.
How awesome did you feel? You're like, that's the best picture I've ever taken. Like
Oh
that
yeah.
sense of
Well,
accomplishment and
so
catching that moment in time.
yeah, so I'm gonna point. Like, how do I get my? All right, there. That picture right there that hangs on the wall. That was from that trip, and
Awesome.
you can't. It's hard to see there, but what in that image is an owl. It's actually a great gray owl, which is like a very rare thing to spot. Very few people see them, and it was kind of funny because we were in the Tetons, and then we left and we went up to Yellowstone, and we went out to a place called Heart Lake, which is, it was like an 8 mile hike out and back. And it was on that way, on that hike where I don't know why, maybe it's the cop instinct in me, right? Just like something caught my eye. And so I turned and I looked, and it was pretty good distance away. And I was using an old, it was a 35 millimeter Pentax K1000. So anyone that's into photography probably knows, like, it's a great camera to learn on. But I had a 200 millimeter lens, and I just, I got my camera out. I think I got three shots of that before it just kind of drops out of the tree, wings spread. It's just gigantic owl that just goes floating through the woods like without making a sound. It was just one of the most surreal things I'd seen. And when we got back to, we were actually at like a little shop where there, and inside of Yellowstone, we were getting a drink and stuff, and there was a ranger in there, and there were some books in there, and I saw there was one that was like the Owls of Yellowstone. So I grabbed my buddies and I'm like, hey, I'm like we started looking through, and I found it. I was like, that's it. That's the owl I saw. And the ranger that was there, I can't remember how the conversation came up, but he was kind of like, he's like, oh, you didn't see that? And I was like, yeah, I did. I just got a picture of one of those. He's like, no, there's only like 20 pairs of those in all of North America. So he's like, you probably saw this or whatever. I'm like, no, like, dude, so. And, it's kind of funny. So it wasn't until actually I got home and got my, this is not digital photography, right? I had to go home and, get my film developed. And anyway, it's a long way of saying it was, it turned out to be a great gray owl. So I've got
That's awesome.
it's probably not the best, it's not one of the best pictures I've taken, I could have been closer, it would have been nice, but I keep it for that very reason. Like, it was kind of like I captured something that very few people get to see. And the lesson here is, like, for me, was like, if I wouldn't have been exercising and doing the things like to stay physically fit, I would have never gone on that hike.
Yeah.
Like, I would have never gone on an 8 mile hike. I wouldn't have just done, 40 miles through the backcountry of the Grand Tetons. I wouldn't be carrying all that gear. Um, and if I didn't take an interest in photography, then I wouldn't have been there in the first place to be able to do that. So it's, you start somewhere small, and you just never know where it's going to lead you. And I can't say how much I fully support what you're talking about. And on a music thing, I will say this is kind of funny too, because, and I don't know why, but growing up, I never listened to classical music. But I kind of developed an interest
It's
in it when I
calming.
was in college. But like, there were times, like, on my way to work, I would listen to NPR, and I just listened to classical music in squad car. And there were times, like, hey, like, I want to listen to rock or country or whatever. But a lot of times in those midnight hours, just listening to classical music had a very calming effect, and very helped me regulate. And looking back, it was emotionally regulating.
So what's very interesting about that is, in the well-being science, there's two primary um, times of well-being. There's hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being. Hedonic meaning in the moment, immediate gratification. What can I do? What am I doing right now to feel the best that I can? Eudaimonic is more of a long view, where it's your overall well-being picture, and here's what I'm doing to set myself up for life, right? And music is associated more with an hedonic well-being in the moment. It will immediately change how you feel, positively or negatively, depending on how you're using it. Whereas something like photography, visual art, literature is going to be more of the eudaimonic range, where it is a long-term feeling, especially when you're creating something of yourself or for yourself. It's more of a long-term process. But yeah, music is immediately changes your mood in one way or another. And that's why, when you're looking at TV shows, movies, soundtracks are such a huge part of that. If you've ever tried to watch something without the sound, it's almost irrelevant. That sound is what changes the way you feel about what you're watching. And that's the same thing in life. That's why I always like told these guys, don't listen to this crap at 3 a.m. It's not good for you. You're going to make bad choices because of it. But yeah, listening to classical music, I was introduced to that a couple times throughout my life, but from a thought and emotional perspective was during my program at Penn. And we listened to this unbelievable young woman. Her name is Pallavi. She's a concert pianist. She also does music towards mental health, but she was a graduate of the Curtis School, which is like the primary virtuoso school for musicians in Philly. And listening to her play, closing my eyes, I'd never heard that piece of music before in my life. I didn't know who the composer was, and it was irrelevant. But I heard the story in the piano. And I can't get that with other music that doesn't have words to it. So when you're listening to classical music that doesn't have words at all, you can still hear the story. You can hear the boat going through the ocean. You can hear the waves crashing over the bow just in the sound of the piano. It's wild to me, and it changes everything.
Very cool. Very cool. Uh, if you had if you had the opportunity now to go back in to your, whether to your police department or another police department, what are some of the things you might do for like a new recruit coming in? Like how would you expose them to some of these things? Because I'll give you an example. Like you talk about eudaimonia, like Brian Johnson. I've read about it, I've heard that before, but his Train Heroic program I think is fantastic. But he talks a lot about that as well. I did another program with Stephen Kotler's program called the Zero to Dangerous with the Flow Collective Research. And in that program, I was part of the program I went through is I was required to work with a coach. And I've talked about this, previously on the podcast, but that that was at probably year 24 in my career, 24 going on 25. And I loved that program. I loved the science behind it. I saw a lot of benefit that we could bring back to the agency and what we were being taught. But there was a part of it that made me very nervous and very apprehensive, and that was I was going to have to work with a coach. So like I've been through leadership training, I've been first man through the door and kicking in doors on search warrants, as part of a SWAT team. I've done a lot of these things, but that was probably one of the more nerve-wracking things that I've done. And my coach was from New York City. And the reason I chose him was because he had worked with FBI HRT members previously. And I tell this story because I like the first couple minutes, I was really nervous, but after about 10 to 15 minutes, I was like, okay, this is kind of cool. This is a really neat experience. And then by the end of that first hour of working with a coach, I was like, why didn't I do this 25 years ago? Why didn't I have this opportunity at the beginning of my career? And so that has always stuck with me. And
I'm
so,
so happy you bring that up because the science of positive psychology is the science foundation behind coaching.
yeah,
And the coaching industry is new. I don't say it's new. It's been around for 25, 30 years, but it's exploding now, but not in first responders and law enforcement. And I'll get to that in a second. But Dr. Seligman also talks about in his book Flourish. By the way, while that is a foundational book of his work, I would say that he's written 7 others, and he has one
yes.
coming out in a few months. So
Oh, nice.
while there's so much in that book, he has done so many other things, but we just keep coming back to that one. So in that book, he talks about the 60% threshold for conventional therapy. And whether that's biopharma or psychotherapy, there's a 60% threshold to healing, which would be like -10 to 0. And then that other 40%, that 0 to +10, comes from coaching. That's the positive psychology piece, rather than conventional psychology, which is strictly focused on amelioration of your issues or your problems to get you to fix. But that's a survival. What do we do about thriving? And that's the positive psychology piece. And wow, I just completely got off track here what I was going to say.
Well, the coaching and law
The coaching,
enforcement and
sorry,
going
there you go,
back
coaching.
and going
So
back.
coaching
Yeah.
is that 40%. It's not me telling you what's wrong with you and how to fix it. It's me asking you the questions about yourself and you coming up with the ideas and how you're going to do better because you know yourself best. And I, while this has been such a successful piece of the corporate world, where we've had these experts come in and coach corporate leaders or even budding leaders to become good leaders, we have been so reluctant in first responders and law enforcement to be able to take on that kind of support. And I don't understand it. I know so many people that have been cops that are now coaches or coaches that tried to work with cops, and they're like, it is a non-starter, absolute non-starter. And I don't understand why we're so reluctant to engage in that level of support because it is about you. It is about you making the choices for you. I'm just asking you the questions.
Yeah, well, I'd say, if I'm being candid, I think it would have to be that sometimes as cops, we don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable.
Correct. That's a big
We
part of it.
do not want anyone to see any sign of weakness, right? Weakness is the enemy. And so, and again, that's why I go back to that moment. One of the first things that I did, after my first coaching session was I changed my morning routine. I had been, tinkering with meditation for several years at that point already. But one of the things that, I did, what's the first thing that everyone does in the morning? Like, there's either two things that people do in the morning right now.
Brush your teeth or go to the bathroom.
Yeah. Well, I would say before brushing your teeth, like one of
Check your phone and go to the bathroom.
yes.
Yeah.
And I would say it's in that order, right? Even sometimes
Yeah.
like, man, I got to go to the bathroom pretty bad, but let me see what's on my phone first.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as a chief, I was really guilty of that, right? Because, it's like
What did I miss last night?
I would have a great idea for what I want to get done. And then the first thing I do is look at my phone in the morning and I have my day destroyed by seeing an email or something like that from overnight. But, what he told me was, look, don't look at that phone for an hour. Like you
Yeah.
get up, use the restroom. So it was
Nobody knows when you woke up.
15 to 20 minutes of stretching, and then 10 to 15 minutes of meditation, 10 to 15 minutes of reading, and then 5 to 10 minutes of journaling, just a gratitude journal. Write down five things that, you know, I practiced that regularly for almost 2 years straight. And I still do it today. I don't do it like every day when I wake up, and I probably need to get back to doing that. But I, to your point, why are we reluctant? One of the first gigs that I took in retirement was working for a coaching company and trying to get agencies to come on and because I recognized the difference that it made in me. And I'll make another joke, right? Because one of the other things I did, like I'm a CrossFit trainer, a certified coach. My wife and I owned a CrossFit affiliate for years. Fitness has always been a big part of what I do. But the joke about about CrossFitters, right, is how do you know someone does CrossFit?
They post about it.
Yeah, because that's all they freaking talk about, right?
Yep.
And but and here's why: because they experience the life-changing
Agreed.
like physiological impact of this. Like, wow, it's like, and when somebody has something that's that impactful, what do they want to do? They want to share it. Like, I want you to feel what I'm feeling. And so I think we are early, like you and I are both early adopters. We're ahead of the curve. Coaching is here. It's here to stay. And I've brought in, I've done a couple different things at my own agency, bringing coaches, and I do see it as the future. So for anyone
I
that's out
agree.
there that's listening, make sure we'll get David's information in there. There's other information that you can always hit me up about, but I can certainly give you the recommendations on where to go. I think Performance Protocol is a great place but there are other coaching companies out there now too. A lot of individual coaches. So a lot of
You got
good
to find the
things
right
coming.
fit for you.
Yep.
I also feel in the coaching space, it doesn't have to be kind of the Fraser version of therapy either. You don't need to sit on the couch in my office and me ask you thought-provoking questions, and we're having this, meditative Zen moment. It's unrealistic, right? It's not
Yeah.
as, especially as cops, it's not how we operate. So in the spring, I'm actually looking to launch a new branch of the work that I do called positive psychology. And I'm a cyclist, so I want to take people out on bike rides and have their coaching sessions while doing a physical activity. And I
Oh,
think
I
that
love
can
it.
be done in other realms as well. If you're a gym rat, have your coaching session with somebody at the gym, work out together and have these conversations. Or if if you like fishing or hunting, have these kind of hunting's a little bit more difficult because you want to be quiet, but have these conversations while you're doing an activity where the activity, especially a physical activity, is creating that generation of creativity in your brain. And that's a whole nother conversation for another day, the science behind all that. But generating that creativity through physical activity only enhances the person's experiences as they're trying to develop new ideas and new ways on their own. And physical activity and coaching, I think, really go hand in hand. And I'm going to give it a shot, see what happens when the weather warms up here in the Northeast. But
I love it. Coaching psychology. That's better. That might be better than Coptimizer. I love it. All
got to
right.
be creative, kiddo. Got to be creative.
All right, listen, let's wrap this up. We've been going for a long time. We're definitely going to have another conversation. And I want to talk to you offline about a couple things too. So if you had to recommend one or two books, somebody's interested in,
Oof.
turning, learning more about whether it's positive psychology, whether it's resilience. And I'm going to say start with A Resilient Life, start with David's book, and then outside of that, um, what's a book you would recommend?
So I'm going to give the science-based ones. First of all, there's some great books out there written by cops that are experiential, and I think they're fantastic. And any cop that's writing a book or any first responder writing a book, support them. For
Yes.
$20, go out and buy the freaking book. If you don't read it, don't read it, but buy it. Let it sit on your shelf. You'll get to it eventually. But honestly, let's support each other and the work that we're all individually doing. So that's number one.
Amen,
Number
brother.
two,
Amen.
from a research and science perspective, obviously Flourish, we've talked about 100 times over today. I think that's a really good one. Struggle Well is a really good book as well. I don't have the author's name in front of me. I can't come up with it off the top of my head. That's a really good one. The Resilience Factor is Karen Rivich's book is really good. Um, if you want to try to understand how positive interventions can benefit you, I think Sonia Lyubomirsky's book, The How of Happiness, is a really good way to understand how you can get this person activity fit. So where you can use science-based or research-based interventions and tweak them to you. I think that's a good one. And Spark, honestly, is one of my favorites. John Rady's Spark,
Yes.
which talks about physical activity and positive emotions, and the research he has in there related to variable heart rate, as you spoke to, talking about ADHD as well, women's menstrual cycles and positive emotions, and how that's all connected. His book is there's so much packed into that book that I
Yeah,
can't
that's a
recommend
great
it enough.
book. Yeah, and
So those are the science ones.
his follow-up book to that is called Go Wild, which also
Yes.
talks about why exercising in nature has like these amplifying effects.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, really good. All right.
And some of the non-sciencey stuff to get people to think, the Why Cafe is a really good one if you're looking to find your purpose and understand why that's important. The Why Cafe, I think, is really special. Um,
Okay. I've never
yeah.
heard of that. All right. You got some good ones in there.
Oh man, I have a reading list that goes on for a mile. I could. There's just so many good things out there.
Yeah, and I think that's the lesson, right? Like just keep reading, because you never know. Like you're going to find something out there. It's part of that continuous learning, lifelong learning
100%.
process. Eventually you're going to stumble onto something that's going to send you down a path that you would have, maybe never otherwise experienced. So awesome. Where can people find you? What's the easiest way to find you? Because they're
On
going to have
social,
questions.
LinkedIn is probably the best way. It's where I do all my non-personal stuff. I am on Facebook as well, but if it's business or some kind of guidance related work that you want to connect with, LinkedIn is probably the best place. I do have a website as well. It's 64consultants.com. So it's six spelled out SIX, the number four consultants.com. And a lot of all my contact information is on there as well. And I appreciate you plugging the book. It's special to me, and as well as another book I was a part of called Wounds to Wisdom. There were 29 authors involved in that one. We each told our stories in 1,500 words. And at the end of each chapter, there's a section where you can individually capture your thoughts of that individual story and what was relatable to you, and some instructions on how to craft your own story.
Oh, very cool. Very cool.
I would thank you for allowing me to plug those.
Yeah, I'll have to pick that one up. And I will say, like, your book is a quick read, and I think once you get into it, like I said, I did get choked up there a couple times, but there were other times I was laughing out loud. And I think everyone will experience that. All right, everyone, we're gonna wrap this up for good. I promise this time. That's it. No more questions. This has been an amazing episode, and I really appreciate David spending his valuable time with us, with me, sharing his nuggets of wisdom. And that's he talks about the power of story, and I think his book is a powerful story that we can all learn from. So I appreciate him sharing with it. We'll put all his contact information in the show notes as well, so you can drop in there and get it. But until the next time, I'm going to be 1042.